Most people on the northern plains believe winter was survived by fire. They imagined split logs stacked high against a wall. They imagined heavy wool blankets, thick sod walls, and a stove glowing red through the long black hours before dawn. They worried over wood piles, roof beams, frozen wells, and whether the wind would find the smallest crack between the boards and push itself inside like a living thing. But almost no one thought about the ground beneath their feet. They walked over it. They cursed it when it froze. They scraped snow from it. They drove fence posts into it. They buried their dead in it. And still, few of them imagined that the earth itself might become the last thing willing to keep them alive. On the northern plains, that mistake had killed more people than pride ever admitted. A house could fail. A stove could crack. A woodpile could vanish beneath snow. A man could step outside for 2 minutes and never make it back to his own door. But below the frost line, far beneath the screaming wind, the earth kept its own counsel. It did not panic. It did not freeze solid the way the world above it did. It held a slow, stubborn warmth, steady as an old promise. In the autumn of 1884, a 31-year-old widow named Ingrid Halvorsen remembered that promise. She lived on 47 acres of open prairie in Dakota Territory, 11 miles southwest of the small settlement of Grafton. There was no husband beside her, no grown sons to split wood or mend walls, no hired man sleeping in the barn. There were only her 2 daughters, Astrid and Britta. Astrid was 9. Britta was 7. There was a milk cow named Solve. There were 3 laying hens. And there was a $62 debt owed to Mr. Carlisle, the dry goods merchant in town, who had extended credit through the summer with the patient smile of a man already imagining what her land might be worth if she failed. And nearly everyone expected Ingrid to fail. Not cruelly, perhaps. That was the worst part. They did not hate her. They pitied her. The neighbors looked at her sod house, her thin wood pile, her young daughters, and the endless flat prairie around her, and they reached the same quiet conclusion. A woman alone could not last out there. Not through a real winter. Not through the kind of winter that came without mercy. Buried roads, split trees, froze livestock in barns, and turned distance itself into a death sentence. Ingrid heard the concern in their voices. She saw the judgment hiding beneath their kindness. She thanked them. She nodded. And then she stayed. Because Ingrid Halvorsen knew something they did not. She knew survival was not always found above ground. Sometimes, if a person was desperate enough, patient enough, and wise enough to dig, salvation waited underneath the floor. So in the first week of October, while her neighbors watched the sky and counted their firewood, Ingrid walked into the narrow woodshed attached to the north wall of her sod house. She moved a stack of split cottonwood aside. She took up a shovel, and she began to dig. No one saw her. No one understood. And by the time the hard winter came for them all, the widow they had pitied would be the only one ready. Ingrid Halvorsen had not always been the woman people pitied. Before the debt, before the hard eyes of merchants, before the winter warnings and the careful smiles from neighbors who had already decided her fate, she had been Eric Halvorsen's wife. And Eric had been the kind of man a frontier claim needed. He had built their sod house with his own hands, cutting blocks from the prairie and stacking them thick against the wind. He had laid a wooden plank floor so his wife and daughters would not have to sleep directly over packed earth. He had dug their well, broken 16 acres of stubborn land, and planted enough to make the future seem possible. For a while, it had been possible. Then, in the spring of 1883, pain took him. At first, Ingrid thought it was something that would pass. Men on the plains ignored pain until it either killed them or grew tired and left. Eric tried to stand through it. He tried to speak calmly. He tried not to frighten the girls. But by the second day, the truth had become plain. No doctor could reach them in time. By the third day, Ingrid was a widow. Eric was 34 years old. He left behind a house, a well, 16 broken acres, two daughters too young to understand the full weight of death, and a wife who had no time to collapse under grief because the cows still needed milking, the hens still needed feeding, the fields still needed tending, and creditors did not grow sentimental because a man had died. The work did not mourn with her. It simply waited. Every morning, Ingrid rose before light. She carried water. She fed the stove. She milked Solveig. She checked the hens. She prepared food. She mended clothing. She watched the sky. She counted supplies. She counted coins. She counted the days until the weather changed. Grief became something she carried in silence, like an extra bucket of water no one else could see. By September of 1884, the neighbors had begun speaking plainly. The Lindquists lived a mile and a half east, close enough to be called neighbors in that country, though far enough that a winter storm could make the distance feel like an ocean. Carl Lindquist was not a cruel man. That made his advice harder to dismiss. He came to the edge of Ingrid's claim one gray afternoon with his hat in his hands and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He told her there was no shame in leaving. Ingrid stood near the sod house door, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, Astrid and Britta watched from the dim interior, their faces pale in the afternoon light. Carl looked toward the open prairie, then back at her. A woman alone with two children, that far out, with winter coming, in his mind the answer was obvious. She should go back to Minnesota. Her sister was there. The girls would have a safer roof. There would be neighbors close enough to reach. There would be roads that did not vanish beneath snow for weeks. There would be work, perhaps, but not work that began before dawn and ended only when the body failed. Ingrid did not answer immediately, because he was not wrong. That was the terrible thing. Minnesota would be safer. Her sister would take them in. The girls would sleep under a better roof. There would be people nearby. Here, there was dead. Here, there was wind. Here, there was a house made of earth, a cow, 3 hens, 47 acres, and the memory of a husband buried too soon. Carl lowered his voice and reminded her that Eric had been a good man. No one, he said, would think less of her. Ingrid looked past him, over the land Eric had broken. She saw the shallow furrows, the well, the woodshed, the low roof line of the sod house, the life they had tried to build out of grass and labor and stubborn hope. Then she looked back at Carl. She thanked him. That was all. Carl waited, perhaps expecting more. A confession, a plan, a collapse, some sign that reason had reached her. But Ingrid gave him none. So he nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and left. By evening, the story had already begun moving from house to house. Not as gossip exactly, more as a conclusion. Ingrid Halvorsen would leave soon. If not before snow, then after the first bad storm. If not after that, then when her wood ran low. If not then, when one of the girls fell sick. The people around her spoke with the certainty of those who had mistaken pity for wisdom. They saw a widow. They saw 2 children. They saw a debt. They saw winter coming. What they did not see was the folded brown paper Ingrid kept wrapped in cloth and hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed. They did not know about the drawings. They did not know about the notes. They did not know that years earlier, in a farmhouse near St. Paul, her father had sat across from her at a kitchen table and taught her that a house was not always the safest place to survive a winter. They did not know that Ingrid had spent the summer watching shadows, measuring ground, studying the woodshed, counting timbers, and waiting for the right time to begin. So when they looked at her thin woodpile and quiet face, they thought they were seeing surrender. They were not. They were seeing preparation. And that was why, when the first week of October arrived and the nights began to harden with frost, Ingrid did not pack her belongings for Minnesota. She moved the wood aside. She lifted the shovel, and she began the work that would prove every one of them wrong. Ingrid's father, Torvald Nesheim, had never been a man who trusted thin walls. He had grown up in Norway's Gudbrandsdalen Valley, where winter did not arrive politely. It came down from the mountains with teeth. It pressed against roofs, buried paths, froze hinges, and taught every family one lesson before all others. A house was useful, but the earth was older. Torvald had spent 40 years building before he ever crossed the ocean to America. Barns, storage houses, root cellars, smoke houses, timber walls, stone foundations. He had built them all. But the knowledge that mattered most had not come from books, officials, or men with clean hands and fine coats. It had come from an old master builder named Olav Gresseth. Olav had taught him a forgotten kind of construction, older than most people cared to remember. It was not a simple root cellar for potatoes. It was not a shallow pit for turnips and jars. It was a living cellar, a chamber deep enough to sit below the killing cold, a shelter built not for convenience, but for survival. Olav had once told Torvald that when the air betrayed a person, that person had to go where the air could not reach. Torvald never forgot it. Below the frost line, the ground held a steady temperature, not warm like a stove, not comfortable like a feather bed, but steady, 40 degrees, 45 degrees, sometimes 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the world above was locked in brutal cold. That difference could save a life. Above ground, a storm could turn a cabin into a coffin. Below ground, with proper ventilation, packed earth, a low entrance, and enough mass to hold warmth, a family could endure what would kill them in the open. Torvald had built 3 such chambers in Norway before leaving for America in 1871. He had seen one shelter an old couple through a mountain storm that froze their goats in the barn. He had seen another keep a mother and 3 children alive when their roof split under snow. So when his daughter Ingrid married Ingrid Halvorsen and followed him west onto the Dakota prairie, Torvald did not give her only blessings. He gave her instructions. During her last visit with him near St. Paul in the summer of 1880, he sat with her at the kitchen table and unfolded a sheet of brown paper. His hands were rough and square, the hands of a man who had spent his life measuring wood by feel and stone by weight. He drew slowly. First, a rectangle, then a deeper rectangle beneath it, then lines for timber, arrows for airflow, marks for depth, notes for ceiling thickness. Ingrid watched every movement. Torvald told her the chamber had to be 8 feet deep, not 6, not 7, 8 if the soil allowed it. She had to get below the bitter part of the frost. He drew the chamber 10 feet long and 7 feet wide. He told her the walls had to be straight, no sloping. Sloped walls collapsed when wet earth changed its mind. Then he drew the ceiling. Timbers across the width. Straw over the timbers. Earth over the straw. Packed hard. The ceiling, he said, must not think like a roof. It must think like ground. Ingrid smiled at that. Torvald often spoke of wood and earth as if they were stubborn animals to be negotiated with. Then he pointed to the floor. He told her to leave it bare. No plank floor, no stone floor. The earth itself was the heat. That part had seemed strange to Ingrid at the time. A floor without boards felt unfinished, poor, primitive. But Torvald shook his head. A wooden floor, he told her, separated a person from the very thing trying to help. Then came the ventilation. He drew a narrow shaft rising from the chamber at an angle. Air had to move. If it did not move, warmth became danger. A candle would tell her whether the chamber breathed. The shaft had to be angled, not straight down. Its opening had to be protected from direct wind, but placed where passing air would pull stale air upward and out. Torvald warned her never to trust a chamber that did not breathe. He drew the entrance last. A hidden trapdoor. Small. Strong. Covered when not in use. He told her such things were not built for praise. They were built so fools would not interfere before the storm proved the builder right. Ingrid looked at him then and asked whether he thought she would need it. Torvald did not answer quickly. Outside the farmhouse, summer insects hummed in the grass. Somewhere beyond the open window, someone was leading a horse across the yard. It was warm that day, almost too warm, and winter felt like something that belonged to another country. But her father's face did not soften. He told her that if she stayed on open land long enough, she would need everything she knew. Then he folded the paper and handed it to her. Years later, after Eric was dead, and the neighbors were telling her there was no shame in leaving, Ingrid took that same paper from its cloth wrapping beneath her bed. The creases had softened. The ink had faded at the edges. In one corner, her father had written a final warning in Norwegian. She had read it so many times she no longer needed to translate it. The cold did not care who deserved to live. Build before it asked. By October of 1884, Ingrid understood. She did not have money. She did not have a husband. She did not have enough firewood to waste. She did not have the luxury of waiting until danger announced itself. But she had her father's drawings. She had two hands. She had a shovel. And beneath the plain dirt floor of her woodshed, she had the one thing no creditor, neighbor, or winter storm had yet taken from her. Depth. Ingrid did not begin digging in the open yard. That would have been foolish. On the prairie, even emptiness had eyes. A neighbor passing at a distance might notice fresh earth. A merchant delivering supplies might ask questions. A child might speak carelessly in town. And once people began asking questions, they would begin offering advice. Advice was the one thing Ingrid could not afford. So she chose the most ordinary place on the whole claim, the woodshed. It leaned against the north wall of the sod house, a rough structure 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, built more from necessity than elegance. Its roof was made of rough planks covered in tar paper. Its floor was dirt. Its walls kept out some wind, but not all of it. To anyone else, it was a place for firewood, broken tools, and forgotten scraps. To Ingrid, it was cover. From the road, the woodshed could barely be seen. From the south, the sod house blocked it. From the east, stacks of wood and the low roofline disguised any change. If fresh earth appeared along the wall of the house, no one would question it. Plenty of settlers banked dirt against sod walls before winter. So that was what she made them see. On the first morning of October, Ingrid moved the wood from the north corner of the shed. She did it carefully, keeping the outer stacks mostly unchanged, so that from the doorway, nothing looked disturbed. Then she took up the long-handled spade. The first cuts were easy. The topsoil was dark and rich, the kind of prairie soil men boasted about in town when they wanted to sound certain about the future. It came up in heavy slices and fell into the wheelbarrow with a damp, soft sound. Ingrid worked without speaking. Astrid and Britta knew better than to interrupt her when she had that look on her face. They helped where they could, bringing water, carrying small tools, watching the cow, and gathering chips from the woodpile. By noon, Ingrid's shoulders burned. By evening, her palms had blistered. By the third day, the blisters had broken. Still, she dug. Load after load, she lifted the earth out of the hole, shoveled it into the wheelbarrow, rolled it from the shed, and piled it against the south wall of the sod house. To anyone watching, she was simply strengthening the house against winter. In 3 days, she moved 63 wheelbarrow loads. By the 9th day, she had reached the depth her father had demanded, 8 feet. She stood at the bottom of the pit, breathing hard, her skirt stained with clay, her hands wrapped in cloth, her back aching so sharply that each movement sent pain through her ribs. Above her, the square of daylight looked small. The woodshed smelled of dirt, wood chips, cold air, and sweat. She had moved nearly 4.5 tons of earth by herself. Not because she was strong enough, because she had no other choice. The chamber was 10 feet long and 7 feet wide, cut as straight as she could make it into the dense subsoil. The walls were pale clay mixed with fine gravel, harder than the topsoil and more stubborn under the shovel. Every inch had to be carved. Every corner had to be corrected. Every mistake could become a crack later. At night, while the girls slept, Ingrid sat by the stove and studied her father's drawings by lamplight. 8 feet deep, 10 feet long, 7 feet wide, ceiling timbers across the chamber, straw, packed earth, bare floor, ventilation shaft, hidden trap door. She repeated the order until it became less like a plan and more like prayer. The digging had been brutal, but the ceiling was the true problem. There were no clean 6-inch timbers waiting on the open prairie, no neat stack of beams behind the house, no money to buy proper lumber in Grafton. But months earlier, Carl Lindquist had offered her deadfall from the cottonwood stand near the creek on his claim. At the time, he had thought he was offering firewood. Ingrid had known better. On a hard, frosty morning in the second week of October, she walked to the creek with her saw, an axe, rope, and solved the cow. The cow was not a horse. She did not like being treated like one. But she was strong, patient when bribed with feed, and better than nothing. Ingrid cut 7 cottonwood poles, each roughly 8 feet long, thick enough to bear weight if seated properly into the chamber walls. It took her 2 days to haul them home. 2 poles at a time, lashed onto a sled, with Solveig pulling slow and offended across the frozen ground. Each round trip was 3 miles. 4 trips. By the end, Ingrid's arms trembled so badly she could barely loosen the rope. But the timbers were home. On October 14th, she lowered them into the chamber, one by one. She had carved notches into the opposing walls so each pole could rest firmly in the earth. The work was awkward and dangerous. A slipping timber could break her hand, crush her foot, or knock her unconscious at the bottom of a hole no one knew existed. She moved slowly, measured twice, lifted once. When the 7th pole settled into place, Ingrid stood beneath them and pressed both hands against the nearest timber. It did not shift. For the first time since she had begun, she allowed herself one full breath. Then came the gaps. Her father had taught her a trick from Norway, something he called frost mortar. Ingrid tore strips from old burlap sacks, soaked them in water, and packed them between the cottonwood poles. In the freezing air, the wet burlap hardened. Not like stone forever, but firm enough for winter. Firm enough to stop drafts and hold loose matter in place. Above the timbers, she spread straw. Not a thin decorative layer, but a thick bed of it, 12 inches, then 14, then more where the gaps demanded it. She used what had been meant for Solveig's bedding and added dry grass gathered near the creek. Then she replaced the earth, layer by layer, tamping it with the flat of the spade, pressing it with her boots, making the ceiling think like ground, just as her father had said. When she was finished, the woodshed floor had risen by several inches. Not enough to alarm anyone. A dirt floor in a woodshed was never level for long. Settling, spilled chips, carried mud, and winter preparation could explain almost anything. Ingrid scattered wood chips over the disturbed ground. Then she restacked the firewood on top. The chamber vanished. But a shelter no one could enter was useless. So she built the trapdoor. The frame came from 2 by 6 inch lumber she had bought in Grafton months earlier under the plain excuse of repairing the house floor. No one had questioned it. A widow with a failing house always needed boards. She cut the door from doubled planks, heavy enough to hold weight, small enough to conceal, and strong enough not to betray itself with a hollow sound. She fitted leather hinges cut from old harness scrap and made a recessed pull ring from a bent nail and a loop of worn leather. When closed, the trapdoor lay almost flush with the floor. She covered it with dirt, then wood chips, then a few ordinary scraps that looked as if they had fallen there by accident. Astrid walked across it twice without noticing. That pleased Ingrid more than it should have. Britta dropped a mitten directly over it and never looked down. That pleased her even more. But the chamber still needed to breathe. On October 19th, Ingrid borrowed a long-handled auger from Carl Lindquist. She told him she needed it to make drainage holes in the water trough. That was true. She did make the holes. Then she carried the auger into the woodshed and began boring the ventilation shaft. Her father's drawings showed the shaft angled at 45 degrees, rising from the chamber ceiling to the outside of the north wall. Not straight upward. A straight shaft invited cold air to fall into the shelter like water into a well. An angled shaft, properly placed, could use the passing wind to pull stale air out. It was not magic. It was knowledge. The opening emerged 6 inches above the ground outside the woodshed wall, angled slightly downward so snow and direct wind would not pour into it. Ingrid shielded it with rough boards and packed earth around the edges. Then she tested it. She climbed down into the chamber with a candle, struck a match, and held the flame near the base of the shaft. The flame bent. Not wildly. Not enough to blow out. Just enough. A small, steady lean toward the opening. The chamber was drawing. Ingrid watched that flame for a long moment. A house could lie to a person. A neighbor could be wrong. A merchant could smile while waiting for failure. But a candle told the truth. The chamber breathed. Only then, Ingrid began stocking it. 40 pounds of dried beans. 30 pounds of cornmeal. Salt pork wrapped in oilcloth. Preserved vegetables sealed in jars. A tin of lard. 2 wool blankets. Spare heavy clothing for herself and the girls. Matches. Candles. A small oil lantern. 2 full pints of lamp oil. And finally, wrapped in cloth and placed where damp would not reach it, her father's brown paper drawing and his final letter. She did not bring down luxuries. There was no room for sentiment beyond what could help them live. Yet when she placed the letter inside, her hands lingered on it. For a moment, the chamber was not just earth and timber. It was Norway. It was her father's voice. It was every warning she had once heard and not fully understood. Above ground, the wind moved over the prairie. Inside the sod house, her daughters were finishing their chores. Somewhere in Grafton, Mr. Carlyle was probably calculating debts. Somewhere to the east, Carl Lindquist likely believed she was still deciding whether to leave. Ingrid climbed out of the chamber, closed the trapdoor, brushed dirt over the seams, and scattered wood chips until the floor looked untouched. Then she stood in the dim woodshed and listened. No sound rose from below. No sign revealed what she had built. To the world, nothing had changed. A widow still lived on 47 acres with 2 daughters, 1 cow, 3 hens, and not enough visible strength to survive a killing winter. But beneath the woodshed floor, 8 feet down in the steady dark, Ingrid Halvorsen had made a place where the cold would have to fight harder to reach them. And for the first time since Eric's death, she had something better than hope. She had a plan. The first winter did not come like a legend. It came like work. Slowly, then all at once. By late November, the prairie had hardened. The grass lay flat under frost, brittle and silver in the morning light. The well rope stiffened at night. The hens complained in low, irritated clucks whenever Ingrid opened their crate before sunrise. Solveig's breath steamed in the barn like smoke from a small fire. The sky grew wider, colder, less forgiving. Still, the winter of 1884 into 1885 was not the kind men would later speak of in feed stores with lowered voices. It was hard, yes. All winters on the northern plains were hard, but it did not yet carry the feeling of judgment. For Ingrid, that was mercy. She was not ready to prove everything at once. The chamber beneath the woodshed had been completed in secret, but completion was not the same as trust. A thing could be built correctly and still fail when the first true test came. Earth could shift, timber could groan, straw could settle unevenly, the ventilation shaft could clog with snow, the trap door could freeze in its frame. Every night after Astrid and Britta slept, Ingrid went into the woodshed with a lantern and checked the floor. She brushed aside the chips, pressed her fingers to the trapdoor seam, listened. Then she lifted it and climbed down. The first few times, the darkness below felt like a question. The chamber was not frightening exactly, but it had the silence of a place waiting to be needed. The walls held the smell of clay and straw. The cottonwood poles above her head looked crude in the lantern light, but solid. The packed earth floor was cold under her boots, yet not bitter in the way the surface ground had become. She checked the stored food. The beans, the cornmeal, the salt pork, the jars, the lamp oil, her father's letter. Then she tested the air. Always the air. She would light a candle and hold it near the ventilation shaft. If the flame leaned, the chamber breathed. If it stood too still, she would worry. If it flickered too hard, she would worry more. But night after night, the flame bent gently toward the shaft. A small, steady answer. The chamber breathed. By December, the visible woodpile had begun to shrink. Not dangerously yet, but enough for Ingrid to count it more often. She knew how much the stove consumed on calm days. She knew how much it consumed when the wind pressed against the sod walls. She knew how quickly warmth disappeared after midnight if she let the fire drop too low. There was no waste in her house. A log was not a log. It was an hour. Sometimes two, if burned carefully. On the morning of December 27th, the sky turned the color of iron. Ingrid noticed it before breakfast. The air had become too still, the kind of stillness that did not mean peace, but pressure. Solveig refused to move from the lee side of the barn. The hens kept close together. Even Astrid, who had begun to inherit her mother's habit of watching weather before speaking of it, looked toward the horizon and said nothing. By noon, the wind began. By evening, the world had vanished. Snow struck the sod house sideways, not falling so much as being thrown. It scratched against the window and packed itself into every seam around the door. The roof groaned. The stove burned greedily, swallowing wood faster than Ingrid liked. Astrid helped carry fuel inside before the worst of it hit. Britta sat near the hearth with her knees pulled under her dress, trying not to show fear and failing in small ways. Too many questions, too many glances at her mother's face. She asked if it would stop that night. Ingrid set another piece of wood into the stove and told her yes. She did not add that it might stop tomorrow, or the next day, or only after it had taken what it came for. The first night, they remained above ground. Ingrid kept the fire steady, slept in short pieces, and woke each time the wind changed its voice. Sometimes it moaned against the north wall. Sometimes it struck like a fist. Near dawn, the stovepipe rattled so hard that Ingrid rose from bed with her heart in her throat. Still, the house held. By morning, the window was filmed with ice from the inside. The water pail near the door had formed a skin of frost. The girls ate cornmeal mush wrapped in blankets. Ingrid checked the wood. then checked it again. The storm continued through the day. By the second evening, the temperature inside the sod house had fallen lower than she wanted, despite the fire. The wind seemed to find new weaknesses with each hour. A draft slipped along the floorboards near the west wall. The stove radiated heat only in a tight circle, and beyond that circle the room belonged increasingly to winter. Ingrid knew the calculation. If she kept burning wood at that rate, they would stay above ground for a little while longer. And then they would have less wood when the storm ended. Less wood for the next storm. Less wood for January. Less wood for the nights when sickness came or the stove needed to be fed without pause. The chamber had been built for exactly this kind of decision. Not when death was already inside the room. Before. That was the difference between preparation and panic. Late on the second night, Ingrid stood, pulled on her coat, and wrapped a scarf around her head. Astrid watched her. She asked if they were going below. Britta looked up sharply. Ingrid paused. She had not told them everything. Not because she wished to frighten them, and not because she thought them foolish, but because children carried secrets poorly when fear pressed against them. They knew there was a place beneath the woodshed. They knew their grandfather had taught their mother something. They did not yet understand that the place had been built because their mother believed the house itself might not always be enough. Ingrid told them that, yes, that night they would go below. Britta's mouth trembled. She asked if Ingrid meant underground. Ingrid told her it was for warmth. Britta asked if it was like a grave. The words struck Astrid before they struck Ingrid. The older girl turned on her sister and said it was not a grave. Britta's eyes filled. Ingrid crossed the room and knelt in front of her youngest daughter. She told Britta, no, not a grave, a cellar, a strong one. Their grandfather had known how to build such places. He had taught Ingrid. They were going there because the earth was warmer than that room now. Britta did not look convinced. Children were not fooled by confident voices as easily as adults wished. But she let Ingrid wrap her in wool. They prepared quickly. Heavy stockings, extra skirts, coats, mittens, scarves over the face. Ingrid tied one end of a rope to the inside latch of the house door and the other around her own waist. The woodshed was only 12 feet away, but in a blizzard, 12 feet could become a mile if the wind spun a person blind. She opened the door. Snow burst in immediately. The room filled with a white rush of cold. Astrid took Britta's hand. Ingrid stepped out first, leaning into the wind, one hand on the rope, the other holding the lantern close beneath her coat. The snow struck her face like thrown sand. For a moment, the woodshed disappeared, though she knew exactly where it stood. She told the girls to hold tight. They moved together. One step, then another. The rope went taut. Astrid stumbled but did not fall. Britta began crying before they reached the shed. Ingrid found the door by touch, shouldered it open, pulled the girls inside, and forced it shut against the wind. The sudden dimness felt almost peaceful. Inside the woodshed, snow hissed through cracks but no longer blinded them. The wood stacks loomed around them like dark walls. Ingrid brushed chips aside with shaking hands, found the leather pull, and lifted the hidden trapdoor. Warmth did not rise from below. Not like a stove, not like a miracle, but neither did killing cold. That alone made Ingrid's throat tighten. She lowered the lantern first, then Astrid. The older girl climbed down carefully, placing her boots where Ingrid had shown her, gripping the rough ladder rungs with both hands. When she reached the floor, her voice came up from the dark, telling them she was down. Britta refused at first. She said she did not want to go. Ingrid did not scold her. She said there were moments when fear had to be carried, not corrected. She gathered Britta against her chest and climbed down with the child clinging to her, one rung at a time, until her boots touched the packed earth floor. And she pulled the trapdoor shut above them. The sound was final. Britta began to cry in earnest. The chamber was dark except for the lantern. The walls leaned close in the wavering light. The ceiling timbers were low enough to remind every adult that tons of earth rested above them. Wind could still be heard, but faintly now, as if it belonged to another world. Astrid stood very still, taking it in. Britta buried her face in Ingrid's skirt. Ingrid hung the lantern from a bent nail in one of the ceiling timbers. Its light spread across the chamber, touching the jars, the sacks, the folded blankets, the pale clay walls, and the floor that had waited all autumn beneath her feet. She took the thermometer from the supply shelf and held it at chest height. 46 degrees. The house above had been colder in the corners. Ingrid let herself believe 1 inch further. She laid blankets on the earth floor, sat with her back against the wall, and pulled Britta into her lap. Astrid sat close enough that her shoulder touched Ingrid's arm. For a while, no one spoke. Above them, the storm threw itself against the woodshed and the sod house with all the blind rage of winter. Below, the candle flame barely moved. Britta cried for 40 minutes. Ingrid counted the minutes not because she was impatient, but because counting gave her something to hold. After a while, the sobbing softened. Then came hiccups, then silence. At last, Britta slept with one hand gripping Ingrid's sleeve. Astrid looked at the lantern and whispered that grandfather had been right. Ingrid looked at the flame. She said he had been. Through the night, the chamber warmed. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. The lantern added its small heat. Their bodies added more. The earth gave what it had kept hidden. By midnight, the thermometer read 52 degrees. Near dawn, it reached 54. 54 degrees. While above them, the prairie was being scoured by wind and snow. While the sod house lost heat through every weakness. While the stove, untended, cooled. While the world outside tried to become unlivable. Ingrid sat awake and watched the candle. Its flame stood calm. Not perfectly still, because the chamber breathed, but steady, alive. That small flame did something to her that no neighbor's encouragement ever had. It proved the work, the pit, the timbers, the straw, the trapdoor, the shaft, the secrecy, the pain in her back, the broken skin on her hands, the 63 loads in 3 days, the 4.5 tons of earth moved by a widow no one expected to last. All of it had led to this. 2 children sleeping underground while the storm failed to reach them. Ingrid did not weep. She wanted to, but she did not. Instead, she took her father's letter from its wrapped place beside the provisions, unfolded it in the lantern light, and read the final line again. Build before it asks. The storm lasted 3 days. They did not remain below the entire time. When the wind eased enough, Ingrid climbed up to check the house, feed the stove, melt water, and tend to Solveig. But each time the sod house grew too cold or the wind rose again, she brought the girls back down. By the end of the storm, the chamber no longer felt like a strange, hidden pit. It felt like a second room, a secret room, a room the winter did not own. The second time they used it came in late January, when Ingrid developed a chest cold that settled deep and hard. A cough was dangerous on the prairie, not because a cough itself killed quickly, but because weakness did. A person who could not rise to feed the stove could freeze beside it. A woman who could not carry water could watch her children go thirsty. Illness turned every chore into a threat. For 2 nights, Ingrid tried to remain above ground. On the third, Astrid found her gripping the edge of the table, breath shallow, face pale. The girls said they should go below. Ingrid almost refused. Pride had killed as many people as weather. But she looked at Astrid, then at Britta, then at the stove burning through another precious armload of wood, and she nodded. They went below again. This time, Britta did not cry. That mattered. She descended first, clutching her blanket and a small rag doll whose face had nearly worn away. At the bottom, she looked around the chamber and chose the place where she had slept before. She said that side was warmer. Astrid laughed softly. Ingrid leaned against the wall and let the underground steadiness take hold around her. For 2 days, the chamber gave her what the house could not. Not comfort, not luxury, just enough. Enough warmth to sleep, enough stable air to quiet the coughing, enough conservation of wood that she did not have to choose between illness now and freezing later. By February, Ingrid trusted the chamber. By March, she depended on it. By April, the snow began to retreat from the prairie, revealing the damage winter had done to everyone else. The Lindquists had lost 2 pigs and a calf. Einar Grandal, the bachelor 3 miles northwest, had lost 7 of his 8 sheep when a sudden cold snap caught him with too little bedding straw. The Peterson family, new from Wisconsin, had abandoned their thin-walled frame house for 6 weeks after their stove cracked and their firewood disappeared faster than they could replace it. Barn roofs had sagged. Fences had vanished under drifts. Livestock had died standing. But on Ingrid's claim, Solveig was alive. The hens were alive. Astrid and Britta were thin, yes, and pale from winter, but alive and bright-eyed. The woodpile had lasted. The house still stood. The widow had not left. No one knew why. So they called it luck. That was easier. Carl Lindquist said it first, or near enough. He said it to his wife, and she said it to Mrs. Peterson, and Mrs. Peterson repeated it to Ingrid one afternoon in April, with the kind, informative tone people used when handing someone the community's opinion of their own life. Mrs. Peterson told Ingrid she had been fortunate, that the winter had not been as bad as it might have been. Ingrid was hanging laundry. She paused with a damp shirt in her hands and agreed that it had not. Mrs. Peterson smiled, relieved that Ingrid agreed. Then she said gently that a woman alone out there could have seen things go differently. Ingrid pinned the shirt to the line and said yes. It could have. Mrs. Peterson waited, perhaps expecting more. Some confession of fear. Some admission that Minnesota would have been wiser. Some promise that Ingrid had learned her lesson. But Ingrid only picked up the next garment. Behind her, the woodshed stood quiet against the north wall of the house. Plain, rough, unimportant house, exactly as she wanted it. Let them call it luck. Luck did not cut cottonwood poles. Luck did not move earth. Luck did not angle a ventilation shaft so a candle flame leaned but did not die. Luck did not keep 2 children warm beneath a storm while the stove above went cold. Ingrid said none of that. The winter had given her the first proof. The next winter would ask for more. In the summer of 1885, Ingrid Halvorsen stopped pretending the chamber was finished. It had worked. That was not the same as being enough. The first winter had taught her 2 things. The chamber could keep them alive, and the neighbors would explain her survival in the laziest way possible. Luck. Ingrid had no hatred for them over it. Hatred was a luxury for people with spare hours. She had weeds to pull, fences to mend, a cow to milk, girls to feed, and a debt that still sat over her life like a crow on a fence post. But the word remained with her. Lucky. It followed her through spring planting. It sat beside her while she patched the roof. It stood near the barn when she buried a hen that had stopped laying and never started again. Lucky. By June, Ingrid had decided that if luck was what people wanted to call preparation, then she would become luckier. The chamber beneath the woodshed was warm enough for 3 people. 4, if they sat close and conserved oil. But it was cramped, too cramped for comfort, and worse, too cramped for possibility. Her father's notes had mentioned livestock, small livestock, not cattle. In Norway, old builders had sometimes brought goats, sheep, hens, even a calf into lower shelters during the worst cold. Not because they were sentimental, though some were, because animals produced heat. A living body, even a small one, was a stove that required feed instead of firewood. Solveig was too large. Ingrid knew that at once. The cow could never be lowered through the trapdoor, and even if she could, the chamber would become dangerous and foul within hours. But the hens were another matter. 3 hens could survive in a crate. 3 hens could give off warmth. 3 hens could continue laying when the world above became too cold for life. So Ingrid began to dig again. This time, not downward, sideways. She worked in the eastern wall of the chamber, carving out a low alcove 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep. It was not tall enough for an adult to stand in comfortably. That did not matter. It was not meant for standing. It was meant for storage, animals, and heat. The work went slower than the first excavation. The subsoil had settled hard over the winter, and every shovel cut came up heavy. Ingrid could not move as much earth without attracting notice, so she spread the spoil carefully, some against the sod house, some beneath the barn wall, some mixed into the garden beds as if improving drainage. There was always a way to hide work if a person was willing to make the work look ordinary. Astrid helped more that summer. She was 10 now, old enough to understand that the hidden room was not childish adventure, but survival. She carried small baskets of loosened clay. She held the lantern. She watched her mother cut the curve of the alcove opening with the same concentration another child might give to embroidery. One evening, Astrid asked why the opening had to be so low. Ingrid was kneeling at the base of the wall, scraping clay with a hand tool. She told Astrid that warmth did not leave as quickly through a low opening. Astrid looked at the passage and asked if it was like closing a coat. Ingrid smiled. Yes, like closing a coat. Britta was less interested in engineering. She named the alcove before it was finished. The chicken room. So the chicken room it became. Ingrid laid 6 inches of clean sand over the alcove floor and built a low manger against the far wall for feed. She made a hinged crate that could hold the hens without crushing them together, with enough gaps for air but not enough for panic. Then she cut a smaller trapdoor above the alcove through the woodshed floor, hidden beneath a stack of kindling and scraps. The first time she lowered the hens into the crate, they protested as if being transported to prison. Britta took this personally. She said they did not understand they were being saved. Ingrid looked at the birds flapping and scolding in the crate. Most creatures did not. She added a second ventilation shaft for the alcove, angled like the first, small but necessary. A shelter that held people could not be allowed to turn stale. A shelter that held animals needed even more care. Air was invisible. That made it easy to underestimate. But Ingrid's father had been severe on this point. Warmth without breath was death wearing a friendly face. So Ingrid tested the new shaft the same way, with a candle. When the flame leaned, she let herself continue. But the greatest improvement came later that summer, after a week of dry heat left the creek bed low enough for stone gathering. Her father had called it a thermal flywheel. Ingrid had always thought the phrase odd. It sounded like something from a machine shop, not a cellar, but Torvald had liked the image. A flywheel stored motion. A thermal wall stored heat. Stone was patient. That was how he had explained it. Wood burned fast and vanished. Air warmed quickly and cooled just as quickly. But dense stone accepted heat slowly, held it stubbornly, and returned it little by little, long after the flame was gone. A stone wall kept at the earth's steady temperature would not make a chamber warm by itself. But if charged by a lantern, bodies, or even the slow underground warmth, it would resist sudden cold. It would smooth the extremes. It would keep the chamber from falling too fast when the fire went out or the trapdoor opened. Ingrid liked that. She understood slow resistance. Over 3 trips to the creek, she collected 47 stones. Not because 47 held magic, because that was how many she could move. Some were the size of loaves of bread, some were broad and flat. A few were dark shale, heavy for their size, the kind that held cold in the hand long after sunlight touched it. She carried them in sacks, baskets, and once in her apron when she had misjudged her load and refused to walk back empty. Astrid helped with the smaller ones. Britta selected stones based on appearance, rejecting several because they looked mean. The best stones went into the chamber. Against the western wall, Ingrid stacked them in an interlocking mass 4 feet high and 3 feet deep. It was not a pretty wall. It was a useful one, wide at the bottom, tight where it mattered, stable enough that if a child leaned against it in sleep, it would not shift. By the end, the chamber had lost space. That concerned Ingrid. Space mattered in an emergency, but warmth mattered more. A room too large lost heat quickly. A room too small became dangerous. The chamber now felt less empty, more deliberate, shaped by decisions rather than hope. On the first cold morning of October 1885, Ingrid tested the wall. The outside temperature stood at 14 degrees above zero and falling. A hard frost had silvered the grass. The air had the clean, sharp feel that came before true cold began its work. Ingrid descended before dawn and lit the oil lantern. For 2 hours she let it burn. The flame was small, but in a sealed chamber, small things mattered. Heat gathered in the air, entered the packed earth, touched the stones, and settled into them, grain by grain. After 2 hours, Ingrid extinguished the lantern, closed the trapdoor, and left the chamber sealed. Then she waited. Waiting was often the hardest part of good preparation. A fool touched every experiment too soon. Her father had told her that. Let the thing answer in its own time. 12 hours later, Ingrid returned. The air outside had grown colder. The wind had sharpened. In the sod house, the stove had already become necessary before evening. She lifted the trapdoor and climbed down with the thermometer. She stood in the center of the chamber, held it at chest height, and waited. The mercury settled at 51 degrees Fahrenheit. 51. After 12 hours without flame. Ingrid looked at the stone wall. It said nothing, of course. That was the admirable thing about stone. It did its work without needing witnesses. She touched one of the larger rocks with the back of her fingers. It was not warm exactly. No one would mistake it for a stove brick pulled from a fire. But it was not cold in the way surface stone was cold. It held a muted steadiness, a quiet refusal to become what the weather wanted it to become. That evening, Ingrid cooked beans in the sod house while the girls argued softly over whether the hens preferred corn scraps or oats. Outside, the wind moved over the prairie and shook the dry grass. Inside, Ingrid thought of the stones below. She felt no triumph, only a clearer understanding of what remained to be done. The winter of 1885 into 1886 passed with difficulty, but not disaster. The chamber was used sparingly, mostly during the bitterest nights, and once when wind drove snow so hard against the north wall that the woodshed door froze shut from the outside. The hens did better than expected in their underground alcove. Britta insisted they liked it. Astrid said they liked not dying. By spring, Ingrid's debt had shrunk, but not vanished. Her hands had roughened beyond any softness they once possessed. Astrid had grown taller. Britta had lost another baby tooth. Solveig calved, and the calf lived. Life on the prairie did not arrive as victory. It arrived as another morning of chores. Then came the summer of 1886. At first, people welcomed the heat. After a hard winter, warm weather felt like forgiveness. Men spoke hopefully in town. Grass came early. The sky was wide and bright. Livestock spread over the range. Children ran barefoot. Women opened windows and beat dust from bedding. But by July, the old-timers had stopped smiling at the sky. The heat stayed too long. The rain came too little. The grass dried thin. The pastures were chewed low by too many cattle. Creeks shrank. Dust lifted behind wagons and hung in the air after the wheels had passed, as if even the road was too tired to settle back down. Ingrid watched. She had learned to distrust easy summers. Abundance could make people stupid. Warmth could soften judgment. A full field in July could make a man forget January had teeth. The signs came one by one. Squirrels began hoarding earlier and harder than Ingrid remembered. Muskrats built their lodges thick and high. Birds that usually lingered were gone 2 weeks ahead of expectation. The nights cooled too quickly after sunset. The ground took frost early. None of these signs meant anything alone. Together, they meant enough. Ingrid said little about it. People did not enjoy warnings, especially from a woman they had already decided had survived by luck. But she began preparing in the second week of November with a precision that would have looked excessive to anyone who had not paid attention. She moved 30 additional pounds of dried food into the chamber. More beans, more cornmeal, more preserved vegetables. She checked every jar for cracks. She refilled the lamp oil and wrapped the extra matches against damp. She inspected the ceiling timbers, pressing each with both hands, listening for shifts. 2 places where the frost mortar had weakened over summer were cleaned out and repacked with fresh clay and soaked burlap. She tested both ventilation shafts. The first drew cleanly, the second needed clearing. A clump of grass and wind-blown grit had lodged near the outer opening. Ingrid removed it with a hooked wire, then tested again until the candle flame leaned properly. She added one more flat, dark stone to the upper tier of the wall, wedging it into a gap that had bothered her since autumn. Astrid saw her doing it. The girl reminded her that she had already counted the stones. Ingrid said she knew. Astrid asked why she was adding another. Ingrid told her it was because the wall had asked for it. Astrid considered this, then nodded as if that was perfectly reasonable. Britta, carrying a bundle of kindling, looked between them and said walls did not ask. Ingrid took the kindling from her and said good ones did. By mid-November, the hens were permanently settled into the alcove. Their crate, bedding, and feed were ready. Extra blankets were folded on the chamber shelf. A rope was coiled near the house door. Another lay inside the woodshed. Nothing looked dramatic. That was the point. Disaster rarely punished people because they did not make grand gestures. It punished them because they failed to make small preparations before pride allowed them to seem necessary. On November 13th, the first snow came. Not deep, not yet, but it laid a crust over the ground that did not melt. Not deep. Ingrid stood outside at dusk and pressed the toe of her boot against it. The crust held, thin, hard, and stubborn. The ground beneath had frozen earlier than the year before. 3 weeks earlier. She looked west. The sky beyond the prairie was the color of old iron. In the barn, Solveig shifted uneasily. From the alcove beneath the woodshed, faint and hidden, one of the hens clucked in the dark. Britta came to the doorway wrapped in a shawl and asked if it was going to be bad. Ingrid could have lied. Mothers often did, not because they were dishonest, but because children deserved a few more minutes of peace when peace could still be given. But Astrid was standing behind Britta, listening. And Astrid was old enough now to learn the truth before the storm taught it harder. Ingrid said yes. Britta swallowed and asked if it would be worse than last winter. Ingrid looked at the frozen crust, the iron sky, the early dark, and the woodshed that hid the chamber beneath its plain dirt floor. Again, she said yes. That night after the girls slept, Ingrid descended alone. She lit the lantern and stood before the stone wall. The chamber received her with its usual silence. Earthen walls, low ceiling, packed floor, stored food, blankets, hens shifting faintly in the alcove, the smell of clay, straw, oil, and dust. She held the thermometer until it settled. 44 degrees. No flame yet, no bodies, no crisis, just the earth keeping its old promise. Ingrid touched the wall. Not yet, she whispered. Above her, winter was gathering its strength. Below, the stones waited. The first serious storm of that winter arrived on November 17th. It did not come with thunder. It came with silence first. That was what Ingrid noticed before breakfast. Not the cold, not the clouds, not the wind, but the absence of ordinary sound. The prairie seemed to be holding its breath. No birds moved along the fence line. No distant wagon noise carried from the road. Even Solve, usually impatient to be fed, stood strangely still in the barn, her dark eyes fixed toward the north. Ingrid stepped outside before dawn and felt the air. It was wrong. The cold had weight to it. Not the clean bite of a normal November morning, but a pressure that settled against the skin and stayed there. The horizon lay under a low, iron-colored sky. The snow crust from days before had not softened. Beneath her boots, it made a thin, cracking sound, sharp as breaking glass. Astrid came to the doorway wrapped in a shawl and asked if it was coming that day. Ingrid looked toward the northwest. She said yes. Britta appeared behind her sister, still half asleep, her hair loose around her face, and asked what was coming. Astrid answered before Ingrid could. Winter. Ingrid almost corrected her. Then she did not. By mid-morning, the wind began. At first, it moved low across the prairie, pushing loose snow over the crust in long, white threads. Then it strengthened, rising in sudden gusts that struck the sod house hard enough to sift dust from the ceiling. By noon, the world beyond the window had blurred. By evening, it was gone. Snow came sideways. It did not fall from the sky so much as rush across the earth, driven by a wind that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It hissed against the walls, packed itself along the door, and found every weakness in the house with the patience of a thief. Ingrid kept the stove burning. One log, then another, then half a split length of cottonwood she had meant to save for January. She did not like the pace of it. A woodpile was not merely wood, it was time. It was choices. It was the difference between one dangerous night and the next. Every piece placed into the stove solved one problem and created another. Astrid understood this now. She stood near the stacked wood inside the house, counting under her breath. Britta sat close to the stove, hands tucked beneath her arms, and asked why the wind sounded angry. Ingrid set the poker back beside the stove and told her it was because there was nothing in its way. That was the truth of the prairie. There were no forests to slow a storm, no mountains to break it, no friendly hills. Once the wind began moving over that open land, it gathered itself mile after mile until it reached a homestead with the force of something personal. The first night, Ingrid kept them above ground. She did not want to use the chamber too soon, not because she doubted it, but because every emergency required order. If she ran below at the first sign of hardship, the girls would learn fear instead of judgment. So she watched. The stove, the wood, the window frost, the water pail, the girls' faces, the sound of the roof, the direction of the wind. She slept in pieces, waking each time the stove settled or the storm changed pitch. Twice before dawn, she rose and pressed her hand to the inside wall. The sod was cold, but not yet dangerous. The floor near the door had begun to frost. That mattered. By morning, the temperature outside had dropped below 15 degrees under zero. It stayed there. All day, the wind held between 25 and 35 miles per hour, sometimes harder in bursts. The words wind chill were not yet part of the common language in the way they would be later, but the body knew what mathematics had not yet named. Exposed skin hurt almost instantly. Breath froze in scarves. Snow crystals struck the face like powdered glass. The cold did not simply surround a person. It entered negotiations with the blood. Ingrid went to the barn at first light with a rope tied around her waist and the other end fastened to the house door. The barn was not far, but far was a flexible word in a whiteout. She carried warm water under her coat to keep it from freezing too quickly. Solve load when Ingrid entered, and the sound filled the barn with a living heaviness that steadied her. The cow was alive. The feed was dry enough. The door had held. One corner of the barn had drifted in, but not badly. The return to the house took longer. The wind shoved Ingrid sideways twice. Once she dropped to one knee and had to pull herself back along the rope, hand over hand, the pail banging against her leg. When she reached the door, Astrid dragged it open from inside and helped her stumble in. Britta gasped when she saw her mother's face. Ingrid's lashes were white. Her scarf had frozen stiff near her mouth. She told the girls not to look so worried and said she had looked worse. Astrid did not laugh. That was how Ingrid knew the girl was frightened. By the afternoon of the second day, the house began to lose. Not collapse. Not fail dramatically. That would have been easier to explain. It simply stopped keeping up. The stove burned. The fire was real. The iron gave heat. But beyond a few feet from it, the air cooled faster than the stove could warm it. Frost thickened inside the window. A draft slid along the floorboards and curled around their ankles. The water pail, kept too close to the door, formed ice along the rim. Ingrid checked the thermometer. 38 degrees. Inside, she stood very still. The number was not deadly by itself. People could endure 38 degrees in coats and blankets. But the stove was eating through wood at a pace she could not accept, and the storm showed no sign of ending. She went to the wood stack. Counted. Recounted. Astrid watched her mother's hands and quietly asked how much was left. Ingrid did not answer at once. That alone was an answer. If they stayed above ground and kept feeding the stove at the current rate, the wood inside would last through the night. The outer wood pile, buried and frozen in the shed, could be accessed, but only at a cost. Each trip would mean opening doors, fighting drifts, risking injury, losing heat, wasting strength. And then what? Another day? Another storm? January still waited ahead. Ingrid looked at Britta, who had wrapped herself so tightly in a blanket that only her eyes showed. Then she looked at Astrid. She told them they were going below. Britta sat up and asked if she meant now. Ingrid said yes. Her voice was calm enough that neither girl argued. That, Ingrid thought, was something. Children trusted calm, but only when it had been earned. They moved with practiced urgency. Wool stockings, mittens, shawls, coats, blankets rolled tight, a small sack of food, the lantern, matches, a tin cup. Ingrid opened the stove and banked the fire low. Not dead, but low. Enough to preserve the coals if fortune allowed. Not enough to eat their future. Then she tied the rope from the house door to her waist. Astrid tied a second rope around Britta, not because the woodshed was far, but because fear could make small distances treacherous. Before opening the door, Ingrid knelt in front of Britta. She reminded her that she remembered the chamber. Britta nodded. Ingrid reminded her that she remembered it was warm. Britta nodded again. Then Ingrid reminded her that she remembered the flame did not go out. Britta swallowed and said, yes. Ingrid told her that meant she knew what to do. The girl lifted her chin a little and said she did. That was courage, not the absence of fear. Just obedience to the next necessary step. Ingrid opened the door. The storm entered like an animal. Snow burst across the floor. The wind struck the wall behind them. For 1 second, the world outside was nothing but violent white. Ingrid lowered her head, gripped the rope, and stepped into it. The woodshed was 12 feet away. 12 feet. A child could run it in summer without thought. That day, it took all three of them fighting together to cross it. Astrid held Britta's hand. Ingrid pulled forward. The rope trembled between them. Snow filled the space around their boots. The wind tore at skirts and coats, tried to turn them, tried to separate them, tried to make direction meaningless. Then Ingrid's shoulder struck wood. The shed door. She found the latch by feel, lifted it, and shoved. The door resisted. Snow had packed along the base. Ingrid leaned harder, teeth clenched, and the door gave just enough for Astrid to slip through with Britta. Ingrid followed and dragged it shut behind them. Inside, the noise dropped by half. Not silence. Never silence. But enough. The woodshed smelled of cold timber, chips, dust, and the faint animal warmth of the hidden alcove below. Snow blew through cracks in thin streams. The woodpile along the wall stood dark and uneven, but intact. Ingrid brushed aside the chips over the trapdoor. Her fingers found the leather pull. For one breath, she paused. Not from doubt, from gratitude that she had built before this moment. Then she lifted. The dark opening waited beneath the floor. Astrid went first, carrying the lantern. Britta followed, slower, but without crying. Ingrid came last and pulled the trapdoors shut over them. The storm became distant. The chamber received them at 46 degrees. Ingrid checked immediately. 46. 2 degrees warmer than the Earth's usual cold steadiness. The thermal wall had been working even without the lantern. The packed earth had held. The stones had resisted. The hidden room had not betrayed her. Astrid saw the thermometer and smiled for the first time in 2 days. She said the stones had remembered. Ingrid looked at her. Astrid said they had remembered the heat. Ingrid hung the lantern from its nail and said yes. They had. The hens rustled in the alcove, irritated by the intrusion, but alive and warm enough to complain. Britta crawled near the stone wall and sat with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She said it smelled like chickens. Astrid told her that meant they were still alive. Britta considered that and nodded. Then it was a good smell. Ingrid lit the lantern. The flame took, flickered once, then steadied. Light spread across the chamber. Earthen walls, cottonwood ceiling, straw hidden above, food sacks along the wall, stone mass dark and patient beside them. 3 faces made gold by lamplight. For 2 hours, Ingrid let the lantern burn. She did not waste oil casually, but this was not waste. This was charging the chamber. Heat entered the air first, then the stones, then the surrounding earth. The temperature rose slowly. 48, 52, 55, finally 57 degrees. Ingrid watched the number and felt something loosen inside her chest. Not safety. Safety was too large a word, but proof again. The chamber was not merely preserving life. It was giving them margin. Margin meant less panic, less wood burned above, fewer trips through the storm, better sleep, better decisions. At 57 degrees, Ingrid extinguished the lantern. Britta looked alarmed and asked why she had put it out. Ingrid told her it was to save oil. Britta said it would get cold. Ingrid said it would get cold slowly. Britta asked what would happen if it became too cold. Ingrid told her they would light it again. Britta looked toward the stone wall as if deciding whether to trust it. Astrid leaned back against the packed earth and said it would hold. That night, the storm continued overhead. They heard it, but strangely. In the sod house, the wind had been a force against the walls, a pressure that entered the bones. Underground, it became a muffled roar, like a river passing above them in darkness. The trapdoor thudded once under a hard gust. Britta flinched. Ingrid placed a hand over hers and told her it was only wind. Britta asked if it could open the door. Ingrid said no. Britta asked if she was sure. Ingrid thought of the frame, the doubled planks, the locking bar beneath, the dirt and wood stacked over it. Then she said yes. Britta leaned against her and closed her eyes. The hours passed. They ate beans from a jar, cold but filling. Ingrid gave each girl a small piece of salt pork and made them drink water slowly. Breath and bodies warmed the chamber in ways a person could feel, but not see. The hens settled. The lantern remained dark. The candle used for testing the shaft leaned gently toward the air opening, steady and alive. Near midnight, Ingrid checked the thermometer. 52. Before dawn, it read 50. Still enough. 2. Still life. Dawn. No stove. No firewood. No smoke. No desperate feeding of flame while winter stole heat through every crack. Just earth, stone, breath, and preparation. Britta slept with her head on Ingrid's lap. Astrid did not sleep for a long time. She watched the ceiling. At last, she asked if Ingrid ever thought about father. The question entered the chamber softly. Ingrid looked toward the lantern, though it was unlit, and said yes. Astrid asked if he would have built such a chamber. Ingrid considered lying in a comforting way. But Astrid was no longer a child who needed soft lies. She was becoming someone who could carry truth. So Ingrid said no. He would have meant to. Astrid turned her head. No. Ingrid explained that Eric would have been busy with the fields, the barn, the well. Men were often pulled toward what looked urgent. Astrid asked if the chamber had not looked urgent. Ingrid said, not until it was. Astrid absorbed that. Then she said grandfather had known. Ingrid said yes. Astrid said Ingrid had known too. Ingrid looked at her daughter in the low dark. She said she had learned. That seemed to satisfy the girl. A little later, Astrid slept too. Ingrid remained awake. Mothers slept differently in danger. Some part of the mind stayed seated upright even when the body failed. She listened to the breath of her daughters, the faint movement of the hens, the pull of air through the shaft, the storm above, and the occasional shifting tick of cooling stone. She thought of Carl Lindquist telling her there was no shame in leaving. He had meant kindness. But kindness without imagination could still be wrong. By morning, the chamber held at 50 degrees. Ingrid lit the lantern again for 2 hours. The temperature climbed to 55 and settled there. She extinguished it once more. The storm raged for another full day and into the next. 31 more hours after they had gone below, the wind continued its punishment. Ingrid climbed up only when necessary, and each time she did, she tied the rope tight, moved with care, and returned quickly. The house above was colder every time she entered it. The stove had gone out. The water pail had frozen solid. The frost on the window had thickened until the outside light came through it pale and distorted. Once, she stood in the sod house and imagined what would have happened if the chamber had never been built. They could have stayed near the stove and burned too much wood. Then the wood would have run low. Then she would have gone to the shed more often. Then one trip would have taken too long. Then perhaps she would have fallen. Or Astrid would have tried to help. Or Britta would have grown silent under blankets while the room slipped colder hour by hour. There were many ways to die on the prairie. Most began as small delays. She returned below. On the afternoon of the third day, the storm weakened. Not stopped. No storm on the plains stopped cleanly. It retreated in stages, like a hostile army unwilling to admit defeat. The wind dropped first, then rose again, then dropped longer. The snow still moved, but no longer erased every shape beyond the door. Ingrid climbed into the woodshed and pushed the outer door open against the drift. White. Everywhere. The yard had changed. The path to the barn was gone. The south wall of the house was banked high. The fence posts stood like broken teeth above the snow. The sky remained gray, but lighter now, and the air no longer struck with the same murderous force. She went to the house. Inside, the stove was cold. The water pail was frozen solid. A crack had appeared in the lower corner of the south-facing window, thin and crooked, likely from pressure and cold working together through the storm. Ingrid looked at it and almost laughed. A cracked window. That was all the storm had taken from them. A cracked window, some time, and a little oil. She knelt at the stove, opened the draft, and searched the ash. There, a coal remained, small but alive under gray powder. She fed it shavings first, then straw, then a sliver of cottonwood. The fire returned reluctantly, then with appetite. By the time Astrid and Britta came up from the chamber an hour later, the stove had begun to warm the room. A pot of beans simmered. Water melted near the fire. Ingrid had cleared enough snow to reach the barn, and Solveig had survived with little more than irritation and hunger. Britta entered the house and looked around as if returning from a long journey. She announced that their room was colder than the chicken room. Astrid laughed then. She truly laughed. The sound was so unexpected that Ingrid had to turn away for a moment, because laughter after danger was dangerous in its own way. It could loosen everything a person had held tight. They ate near the stove. Beans, cornmeal, a little pork. Nothing grand. A feast. Outside, the wind continued in lower tones, moving over the buried prairie. Ingrid looked at the girls, at their flushed faces, at the steam rising from the pot, at the cracked window, and at the door she had managed to open again. They had passed the first storm of the season. But Ingrid did not mistake survival for conclusion. The November storm had not been the worst. She knew it in her bones. It had been an announcement. A warning shot fired across the prairie before the real siege began. In the days that followed, news moved slowly between claims. A calf lost east of the road. A barn door torn loose. A man nearly frozen trying to reach his own well. A family that had burned half their winter wood in 3 days. Everyone spoke of the cold with irritation, even awe, but still with the belief that such a storm in November might mean the worst had come early and passed. Ingrid did not share that comfort. She cleaned the ventilation shafts again. She dried the blankets. She restocked the chamber. She added more kindling near the trapdoor. She checked the stone wall. She counted the oil. She counted the beans. She counted the days. Above ground, the prairie looked wounded but quiet. Below ground, the chamber waited. And far beyond their claim, across the northern plains, January was preparing something far worse than November had dared to show. The real winter arrived in January. Not the decorative winter men spoke of in November, when they still had full wood piles and enough confidence to complain loudly in town. Not the useful winter that hardened roads and made travel easier for a few bright days. This was different. This was the kind of cold that did not merely descend. It occupied. Storm followed storm across the northern plains, with barely enough time between them for a man to clear a path, feed an animal, or repair what the last wind had damaged. Snow fell, then drifted, then hardened, then was buried under more snow. The world lost its edges. Roads vanished. Fence lines disappeared. Barns became low white shapes in a white field. The sky lowered. The land narrowed. Distance became dangerous. By the first week of January, every homestead had begun to understand the same thing. This winter was not testing them. It was sorting them. On January 9th, the temperature in Grafton fell to 38 degrees below zero. It did not touch that number and rise. It stayed. Hour after hour, the cold held its position like a hand around the throat of the county. The station agent in Grafton recorded winds reaching 47 miles per hour during the worst of it. At that speed, the cold lost all ordinary meaning. It was no longer weather. It was force. Cottonwood trees split from the strain. Iron latches burned the skin. Breath froze along scarves until cloth became stiff as bark. Inside Ingrid's sod house, a jar of ink froze in its well, though it sat only a few feet from the stove. That detail troubled her more than she admitted. Ink was not supposed to freeze in a lived-in room. Not if the stove was burning. Not if the house was winning. But the stove was not winning. It was only delaying defeat. Ingrid had known this storm was coming before the sky confessed it. 2 days earlier, the hens had gone silent in their alcove. Solveig had refused to leave the barn door, even when offered feed. The air had tightened. The world had taken on that strange, listening quality that came before violence. So Ingrid had prepared before the first full blow. She moved the girls below earlier than she might have 2 years before. She did not wait for the house to fall to 38 degrees. She did not wait for the stove to begin swallowing wood like a starving animal. She did not wait for Britta's lips to pale or Astrid's fingers to stiffen. Experience had trimmed the foolishness from her courage. The chamber was already stocked. The hens were already below. The stone wall had been warmed by 2 careful lantern burnings. The water jars had been lowered. The blankets had been laid out. The rope had been fixed between the house and woodshed. The trap door had been cleared from beneath and locked from within. When the storm struck, Ingrid and her daughters were ready. That did not make it easy. Underground, time changed. Above ground, a person could measure the day by window light, chores, smoke, and the distance between one task and the next. Below ground, the world reduced itself to smaller signs. The level of oil in the lantern, the tilt of the candle flame, the breath of sleeping children, the cluck of hens, the thermometer, the sound of wind through earth and timber. The first 24 hours passed with discipline. Ingrid burned the lantern for 2 hours, then let the stone wall return what it had taken. The temperature rose to 58, then slid slowly to 52. She waited. When it reached 49, she lit the lamp again. Astrid noticed the rhythm. 2 hours on, 4 hours off. If the chamber held, and the chamber did hold. Ingrid joked quietly that Astrid trusted stone more than people. Astrid glanced toward the ceiling, where the storm sounded like a distant, endless train. Stone had done better so far. Ingrid almost smiled. Britta spent most of the first day wrapped in a blanket near the wall, whispering to the hens as if they were honored guests rather than smelly contributors to survival. She had grown used to the chamber, but not careless. Each time the trapdoor thudded under a gust above, her eyes lifted. She asked if snow could bury them. Ingrid told her, yes. Astrid looked sharply at her mother. But Ingrid continued before fear could spread. Buried did not mean dead. Snow over the woodshed could even hold warmth if the air shafts stayed open. Britta frowned. So snow was bad and good. Ingrid told her that most things were. That seemed unfair to Britta, but she accepted it. By the second day, the storm intensified. Even underground, they could tell. The sound changed. The wind did not simply pass over the shelter now. It battered the structures above them. Once, a heavy impact shook loose a fine dusting of clay from the chamber wall. Ingrid rose at once and checked the ceiling timbers by lantern light. The cottonwood poles held. The frost mortar held. The straw and earth above them held. Still, she did not sleep afterward. She sat with her back to the stone wall, one hand near the thermometer, the other resting close to the lantern matches, and listened to winter trying to find a way in. It did not. Not there. Elsewhere, it did. On the Lindquist claim, a mile and a half east, the north wall of the woodshed collapsed sometime before dawn on January 9th. Carl Lindquist herded over the storm. Not clearly. Nothing was clear in that wind, but he felt something through the floor and heard a deep cracking sound beneath the constant roar. At first he thought part of the roof had gone. Then he opened the inner door to the lean-to and found snow pouring sideways through the gap where the north wall had been. His firewood was outside. Not all of it. Worse, most of it. The stacked split wood he had spent autumn cutting, hauling, and arranging with such pride had been thrown outward and scattered across the yard. The blizzard took it immediately. Within minutes, the nearest pieces were half buried. Within an hour, the whole pile was becoming a rumor under snow. Carl did what capable men often do when disaster strikes before wisdom has time to speak. He went after it. Anna shouted at him not to. He tied rags around his boots, wrapped a horse blanket over his coat, and stepped into the storm with an axe handle in one hand and a rope in the other. The yard vanished around him. He found pieces of wood by striking blindly beneath the snow, dragging up what he could, staggering back to the house, dropping it inside, and going out again. One trip, then another, then another. Pride kept count longer than sense did. By the time Anna pulled him inside and barred the door, Carl's hands shook so violently he could not untie the rope around his waist. His beard was packed with ice. His eyebrows were white. His boots were rigid with frozen snow. Anna told him, enough. Carl said there was more wood out there. Anna told him there was always more out there. He said he could get it. She looked at his feet and told him no. He could not. When they pulled off the wrappings, pale patches had begun to show on his toes. White, waxy, dead-looking. Frostbite announcing itself before pain could return. Carl stared at them in silence. He had a wife in the house, 4 children, a stove, a winter that had just taken most of his fuel. And outside the temperature was 31 degrees below zero. By morning, the Lindquist family had perhaps 6 hours of heat left if they burned carefully. Perhaps less. The stove was already being fed with restraint. Too much restraint. The kind that made a room slowly colder while everyone pretended not to notice. The smallest child cried whenever the wind struck the wall. The older children sat near the stove with their arms around their knees, unusually quiet. Anna moved through the room with a controlled calm that frightened Carl more than panic would have. She knew. He knew she knew. But neither of them said it in front of the children. Near noon on January 10th, Carl stood. Anna looked at him and told him no. He pulled on his coat. She told him he could not walk to Grafton. Carl said he was not going to Grafton. The room fell silent. One of the children looked up. Carl wrapped rags around his boots again. His feet had begun to hurt now, which was better and worse. Feeling had returned enough to punish him. Anna understood before he said it. Ingrid. Carl did not answer. He did not have to. For a long moment, only the stove spoke, snapping softly over the last pieces of wood. Anna's face changed then. Not with surprise, not exactly. More with the bitterness of someone recognizing a truth she had stepped around for too long. They had all called Ingrid fortunate. They had all wondered how she managed. They had all watched her claim endure when others suffered. And none of them had asked the right question. Carl reached for the door. Anna caught his sleeve. She told him that if he fell, they could not come get him. Carl said he knew. She asked what would happen if he reached Ingrid, and she had nothing. He looked at the children. Then he said he would come back. But they both knew that might not happen. The distance between the Lindquist claim and Ingrid's was 1.5 miles. In summer, a walk. In ordinary winter, an inconvenience. In that storm, a trial. Carl tied one end of a rope around his waist. though there would be nothing to tie the other end to once he left the yard. He wrapped the horse blanket around his shoulders and pulled it low over his head. He took no lantern, useless in that whiteness. No rifle, no pack. Weight was now the enemy. Anna opened the door just wide enough. The storm took him. For the first few minutes, Carl could still feel the line of his own yard, the barn to his right, the collapsed shed behind, the faint depression where the path usually lay. Then the wind shifted and the world became a moving wall. He walked by memory, then by instinct, then by stubbornness. There were no landmarks. The prairie had erased them. More than once he stopped and turned his head slowly, trying to sense direction from the strike of the wind. Snow drove into the side of his face and froze there. His breath came hot and painful beneath the blanket. His feet, already damaged, became first fire, then stone. He thought of turning back. Several times. Each time, he saw the stove at home. 6 hours. Maybe less. So he continued. Once, he fell. Maybe less. Not dramatically. No cliff, no hole, no heroic struggle. His foot caught under crusted snow, and he went down hard onto one knee. For a few seconds, he stayed there, stunned by the effort required to rise. That was how men died. Not in great scenes worthy of retelling. They knelt down for a moment. They rested. They closed their eyes. Carl forced himself up. By the time Ingrid's sod house appeared through the blowing snow, it looked less like a building than a shadow that had agreed to become solid. He reached the door and struck it with his fist. Once. Twice. The third time, his hand barely lifted. The door opened. Warmth touched his face. Not much warmth. The sod house itself was cold, the stove banked low, the air guarded carefully. But compared to the storm, it felt like mercy. Ingrid stood before him. For a moment, Carl could not speak. Snow crusted his beard. His eyes were red from wind. The horse blanket hung from his shoulders like something dragged from a grave. He looked older than he had 2 days before. Ingrid took his arm and pulled him inside. She told him to sit. He obeyed because standing had become complicated. She closed the door, set the bar, and brought him toward the stove. His hands shook so hard, she had to help remove the frozen wrappings. Only then did he find enough voice. He said he needed help. There was no pride in it. No explanation. No apology. Just the words, bare and necessary. Ingrid looked at him. She could have remembered September of 1884. Carl at the edge of her claim, hat in hand, telling her there was no shame in leaving. She could have remembered the way the neighbors had spoken of luck. She could have let that memory stand between them for one cold, satisfying second. But satisfaction did not warm children. She asked how much wood they had left. Carl swallowed. 6 hours. Maybe. She asked about Anna. At home. The children. He nodded. Ingrid looked toward the corner where Astrid and Britta had left their outer things ready. Then she looked toward the woodshed wall, though from inside the house one could not see what lay beneath it. She asked if he could walk back. Carl closed his eyes briefly. He said he had to. Ingrid told him that was not what she had asked. He opened his eyes again. For the first time since she had known him, Carl Lindquist looked afraid in a way he did not bother hiding. He said he did not know. Ingrid crouched and examined his feet. The toes were pale in places, angry red in others. Dangerous, but not yet lost if warmed slowly and kept from refreezing. She told him he would rest for 20 minutes. Carl tried to protest that his family was waiting. Ingrid told him his family would need him alive enough to bring them there. He tried to stand. Ingrid put one hand against his chest and pushed him back down. She was not stronger than him. But certainty has weight, She told him again that he would rest. Carl stared at her. Then he stopped fighting. Ingrid moved quickly. She gave him warm water, not hot. She wrapped his feet in dry cloth. She put a small amount of food into his hands and made him eat. Then she woke Astrid and spoke low. The Lindquists were coming. Astrid understood at once. She asked if all of them were coming. Ingrid said yes. Britta, already awake, sat up from her blanket near the wall and asked if they had room. Ingrid looked at her daughters. That was the question. The chamber had held 3 comfortably, 4 well enough, and could take more if arranged carefully. With Carl, Anna, and their 4 children, there would be 9 people underground. 9 bodies, 9 breaths, 9 sets of fear. Food would stretch, air would need watching. Oil would matter. The hens would have to be moved deeper into the alcove. The blankets would have to be spread differently. The trapdoor would have to remain clear. The shafts would have to be tested again. There was risk. There was no choice. Ingrid said they would make room. Astrid rose immediately. Britta hesitated only a second, then followed. They moved like a practice crew. Astrid carried blankets into the woodshed. Britta gathered the smaller food packets. Ingrid checked the lantern, matches, and water. Carl watched them with a strange expression, as if seeing the inside of a machine he had not believed existed. He asked what all of this was. Ingrid did not pause. She told him it was what should have been built on every claim before the first winter. Carl did not answer. Perhaps he thought she meant it cruelly. She did not. That made it worse. After 20 minutes, Carl stood again. Pain crossed his face, but he held himself upright. Ingrid wrapped his feet better than he had wrapped them himself. She tied cloth over the damaged places, then more over that. She gave him the rope. She told him to follow the wind angle until the creek dip, then bear left. She told him not to fight the drifts where they were high, but to go around. Carl blinked. He asked if she knew the way to his house in those conditions. Ingrid said she knew the land. He almost smiled at that, but the muscles of his face had little strength left. He asked what would happen if he did not return. Ingrid told him he would. He tried again. If he did not return. Again, Ingrid told him he would. This time he heard the command beneath the words. He nodded. Before he opened the door, he turned back. He said her name. For a moment it seemed he might apologize. For the advice. For the pity. For the word luck, though perhaps he had not known how far it had traveled. But men near death learn to spend words carefully. So he only thanked her. Ingrid lifted the latch. She told him to bring them. Then he went back into the storm. The wait that followed was worse than the work. Ingrid hated waiting. Work gave shape to fear. Waiting let it spread. She and the girls prepared the chamber for more people. The hens were moved to the far corner of the alcove, loudly offended by the change. Extra straw was laid near the eastern wall. The second blanket was unfolded and spread over the packed floor. Food was rearranged. Water was placed within reach. The lantern was lit and hung. The stone wall had already been warm for 2 hours earlier that morning, but Ingrid lit the lamp again. More bodies would bring heat, yes, but they would arrive half frozen. The chamber needed to receive them ready, not slowly. She tested both ventilation shafts. The first candle flame leaned properly. The second flickered too little. Her stomach tightened. She climbed up, went outside into the woodshed entrance, and checked the outer opening. Snow had drifted across the small protective board. She cleared it with gloved hands, packed the snow lower around it to shield but not block, then descended again. She tested it once more, but this time the flame bent. Good. The chamber breathed. Above them, the storm continued. 1 hour passed, then another. Britta asked 3 times whether they had gotten lost. The 4th time, Astrid told her to stop asking unless she wanted the same answer again. Ingrid said nothing. She listened. At first, she heard only wind. Then, faintly, something else. At first, not a knock. Not yet. A sound through the woodshed. A scrape. A voice. Ingrid climbed the ladder, lifted the trapdoor, and pushed into the shed. The outer door moved inward with difficulty. Carl came through first, nearly falling. Behind him was Anna, wrapped in layers, carrying the youngest child against her chest. The others followed in a stumbling chain, their faces hidden in scarves, their bodies bent against the storm. One of the children was crying without sound. Another had lost a mitten. The oldest girl clung to Anna's coat so tightly her fingers would not release when Ingrid reached for her. They were alive, barely warm enough to know it. Ingrid told them to get inside. No one argued. There was no time for surprise, no time for explanation. The children were lowered first. Astrid stood below to receive them. Britta guided them toward the blanket with a seriousness beyond her years. Anna descended next, stiff and shaking. Carl came last, with Ingrid close behind him, pulling the trapdoor shut and locking it from underneath. For several seconds, no one spoke. The chamber glowed in lantern light. Earthen walls, low timbers, stone wall, food sacks, blankets, hens rustling angrily in the alcove. 9 people breathing beneath the woodshed while the storm raged over them. Anna Lindquist stood hunched beneath the low ceiling, one hand still pressed to the youngest child's back. Her eyes moved over the chamber slowly, taking in what her mind could not yet arrange. The warmth reached her first. Not hot, not stove warm, but impossible. After the storm outside, after the 1.5 miles through killing cold, after the fear of the stove dying and the children freezing beside it, that underground air felt like stepping into a secret the world should have told them sooner. Anna looked at the stone wall, then the lantern, then the ventilation shaft, then the hidden trapdoor above. Finally, she turned to Ingrid. Her voice came out low, almost wounded. She asked how long Ingrid had had this. The chamber went quiet. Even the children seemed to understand that the question was larger than the words. Carl lowered his eyes. Astrid watched her mother. Britta held a blanket around one of the Lindquist children. Ingrid stood beside the ladder with clay on her skirt, windburn on her face, and the calm of a woman who had already answered that question every night in silence for more than 2 years. She said it had been there since October of 1884. Anna stared at her. Outside, the storm struck the woodshed hard enough to make the trapdoor tremble. Inside, the lantern flame did not go out. It bent once toward the breathing shaft, then steadied. And for the first time, the people who had called Ingrid Halvorsen lucky began to understand what luck had cost. For 72 hours, the chamber held 9 people. Ingrid, Astrid, Britta, Carl Lindquist, his wife, Anna, and their 4 children. 9 bodies beneath the woodshed floor while January tried to erase the world above them. The first hours were the hardest, not because the chamber failed, because the living had to learn how to be still. Fear made people waste motion. It made hands search for things already found. It made children ask questions no adult could answer. It made men stand when there was nowhere to go, and women count supplies already counted 3 times. Ingrid did not allow panic to take shape. She assigned everyone a place. The smallest children near the stone wall. Anna and Carl closest to the ladder, where they could help if anyone needed to climb out. Astrid beside the provisions. They could help Britta near the hens, which pleased her and irritated the hens equally. Ingrid kept herself where she could see everything. The lantern burned for 2 hours. Then darkness, except for one candle. Then lantern again. 2 hours on. 4 hours off. The rhythm became law. Oil was not comfort. Oil was time. By the first night, the temperature inside the chamber had settled at 52 degrees. The Lindquist children, who had arrived shaking and pale, slept beneath blankets on the packed earth floor. Anna sat awake for a long time, watching them breathe as if she expected the warmth to vanish the moment she trusted it. Carl said almost nothing. He had removed the wrappings from his feet under Ingrid's instruction. The damaged skin had color again in places, pain in others. Pain was good. Pain meant life had not yet withdrawn completely. Ingrid warmed his feet slowly. No hot water, no rubbing snow, no foolish frontier remedies that did more harm than cold itself. Slowly, that was what she made him understand. Carl nodded. He was learning that she had been doing more than surviving. She had been studying. Above them, the storm did not weaken. It pressed against the woodshed, buried the yard, and sealed the world into a white violence none of them could see, but all of them could hear. At times the sound lowered into a deep roar. At times it shrieked through cracks in the boards above. Once, something heavy struck the outside wall. Perhaps a loose timber, perhaps a branch torn from some distant tree and carried like a weapon through the storm. One of the Lindquist boys woke crying. Britta crawled over and placed one of her blankets beside him. She whispered that it sounded worse than it was. Ingrid heard the words and looked at her youngest daughter. 2 winters earlier, Britta had called the chamber a grave. Now she was explaining it to another child. That was how survival became inheritance. By the second day, the chamber had changed them. Not fully. Fear remained. But order had pushed it into corners. Anna helped measure food. Astrid poured water carefully, never spilling more than a few drops. Carl slept in short bursts, waking each time the trapdoor creaked. The children learned where not to step, which sacks could be leaned against, and why no one touched the ventilation shaft. The hens, offended by crowding, produced 2 eggs that morning. 2 small brown eggs in the middle of a deadly winter storm. Astrid found them first. For one moment, she simply stared. Then she lifted them like treasure. She called for her mother. Everyone turned. Astrid held the eggs up in the lantern light, and something passed through the chamber that was not laughter yet, but almost. A soft breaking open. A reminder that life was still doing its ridiculous, stubborn work, even 8 feet underground, while the prairie above froze hard enough to split trees. Anna covered her mouth. Carl looked down. One of the children asked if they could eat them. Britta looked offended on behalf of the hens. Not yet. Ingrid took the eggs carefully and placed them near the provisions. They would decide later. But she already knew they would not eat them immediately. Some things fed the spirit better when left whole for a while. By the 3rd day, the temperature outside began to rise. Not to warmth. Nothing so generous. But to 8 degrees below zero. The wind dropped below 15 miles per hour, which on that prairie, in that winter, passed almost for mercy. Ingrid climbed out first. The woodshed door opened only after she threw her shoulder against it. Snow had banked high outside. The yard no longer looked like a yard. The house was half buried on the north side. The path to the barn was gone. The fence lines showed only in broken posts and faint shadows beneath the snow crust. But the sky had lifted. She stood in the doorway for several seconds, letting the cold strike her face. Then she turned back. They could move. Carl wanted to go home immediately. Ingrid looked at his feet. No. His house would still be cold when he arrived. His animals might already be dead. And if they were not, he could not help them by losing his feet. The words were hard, but not cruel. Carl heard the difference. So the Lindquists remained another day. On January 12th, near noon, a figure appeared out of the whiteness. At first, Astrid saw only movement near the far driftline. Ingrid took the rifle down from its place by the door, not because she expected violence, but because desperation could make strangers out of neighbors. Then the figure came closer. A horse. A man hunched over it. Einar Grøndal, the Norwegian bachelor from 3 miles northwest. His horse looked half-starved and furious. Einar looked worse. Snow crusted his coat. His face was red and gray in patches. His beard had frozen into points. He had kept the horse alive by bringing it into his own kitchen during the worst of the storm. That single fact told Ingrid everything she needed to know about how his winter was going. He said little when he arrived. Men alone often save words until they knew they were safe enough to spend them. He had heard there was warmth at the Halvorsen place. No one asked how he had heard. On the frontier, news traveled in ways no map could explain. A sentence carried by a passing rider, a shout between barns, a child repeating something at a well, a rumor crossing frozen land faster than reason. Ingrid led him to the woodshed. By then, the trap door was no longer hidden. There was no point. Secrecy had done its work. Now the chamber had another purpose. Einar climbed down, sat against the earth wall, removed his hat, and said nothing for nearly 3 hours. At last, he looked around and muttered that it was warmer there than in any house he had slept in that winter. That was all. From Einar, it was practically a sermon. The Petersons arrived the next morning. They had survived the worst of the storm at the Lindquist home before the wood failed, then returned to their own thin-walled frame house, only to find it barely habitable. The stove drew poorly. Frost lined the inside boards. Their youngest child had a cough that worried everyone who heard it. Ingrid took them in. Then came the Solbergs from 2 miles south. Then the elderly Brustad couple, moving so slowly through the snow that Astrid and Carl went out with ropes and brought them the last 100 yards. And finally, Mrs. Solberg arrived with a small pig wrapped in a grain sack and held against her chest like an infant. Carl stared at her. She had brought the pig. Mrs. Solberg stared back with the eyes of a woman who had survived 3 storms and had no patience left for male commentary. The pig would have frozen. No one argued. The pig joined the hens in the alcove. The hens objected. The pig did not care. At its fullest, the chamber and alcove held 16 people, 16 souls beneath the earth. And, at various times, 1 dog, 4 hens, and a pig with a personality larger than his body. It should not have worked. Not comfortably. And it did not work comfortably. There were knees against backs, children sleeping across folded coats, people whispering apologies each time they shifted. The air had to be watched carefully. The ventilation shafts had to be cleared from outside whenever drifting snow threatened them. Food had to be rationed. Water had to be brought and warmed. Waste had to be managed with discipline no one enjoyed discussing. But the chamber held. The temperature never fell into danger. The stone wall gave back what it had stored. The bodies added heat. The hens contributed their small living warmth. The lantern burned in careful shifts. The candle flame leaned toward the shaft and did not die. Above them, the winter continued. Storms came and passed. Temperatures rose, then collapsed again. Roads remained dangerous. Livestock died in barns. Men who had once laughed at extra preparation now spoke softly of fuel, shelter, and distance. Every homestead in the county seemed to learn the same lesson in its own painful way. A winter did not care how hard a person had worked in summer. It only cared what had been built before the cold arrived. Ingrid did not become proud during those days. Pride would have been understandable. She had been advised to leave, pitied, dismissed, reduced to luck by people who had not seen the blisters, the clay, the frozen burlap, the hidden trapdoor, the stones hauled from the creek, the nights spent testing candle draft by lantern light. Now those same people sat in the shelter she had built. But Ingrid did not need victory over them. She needed them quiet, warm, breathing, alive. That was enough. One evening, when the chamber was full and the wind had finally dropped to a low moan above, Anna Lindquist sat beside Ingrid near the stone wall. For a long while, neither woman spoke. Then Anna said they should have asked Ingrid how. Ingrid looked at the lantern. Yes. Anna lowered her eyes. She said she had thought Ingrid was fortunate. So had many others. Anna apologized. Ingrid could have accepted the apology kindly. She could have made it easy. Instead, she told the truth. Next time, Anna should build before she understood why. Anna was silent. Then she nodded. That was better than apology. By late February, the worst of the hard winter began to loosen. Not end. A winter like that did not end. It retreated, leaving dead animals, broken fences, collapsed roofs, debt, hunger, and stories behind it. But the storms came less often. The sun stayed longer. The roads began to reappear in pieces. People returned to their claims, taking with them something more valuable than borrowed warmth. They took knowledge. Carl Lindquist was the first to say it publicly. In March, at the feed store in Grafton, he stood among men who had spent the winter losing animals, wood, sleep, and illusions. Someone asked him whether the story was true, whether Ingrid Halvorsen really had a room under her woodshed, whether it had kept people warm, whether 16 people had actually sheltered there. Carl did not embellish. That gave his words weight. He said it was the most practical structure he had ever seen, and he would have one before next winter. He did, with Ingrid's help. He paid her for the design and for overseeing the work. Not charity, not gratitude disguised as coins. Payment, that mattered. By autumn of 1887, Ingrid had paid the remaining debt to Mr. Carlyle. $48 gone, some from calves raised from Solvay, some from the work she did teaching others how to build what they should have built years before. Carlyle took the money without ceremony. Men like him preferred widows in debt. A widow who paid in full offered fewer opportunities. Ingrid left the store with the receipt folded in her pocket. Outside, the wind moved through Grafton Street, carrying dust, voices, and the smell of horses. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because she was sentimental, because a debt leaving the body could feel almost like warmth. The story spread through Pembina County, not as a fairy tale, as instruction. A station agent in Grafton named Hughes, a careful man with a habit of recording weather and local events, wrote about the chamber in his journal on February 22, 1887. He noted that no fewer than 16 people had found warmth and safety there during the severe January cold. He noted that it had been conceived and built by a 31-year-old Norwegian widow working alone. The journal survived. That was the strange mercy of history. It forgot kings of small rooms and remembered, by accident, a woman with a shovel. Ingrid Halvorsen never left her claim. She worked that land for 22 more years. The sod house changed over time. Walls were improved. The barn repaired. The fields widened. The girls grew. Astrid learned the chamber first. Not merely where the food was stored or how the trapdoor opened, but why the shaft had to breathe, why the floor remained bare, why stones mattered, and why a room too warm could be as dangerous as one too cold if the air failed. She later taught the method to other women before her marriage in 1897. Britta became a school teacher in Park River. On cold January days, when the wind scratched at the schoolhouse windows and her students grew restless, she sometimes told them the stories. Not all of it. Children did not need every measurement. They did not need the full account of frostbite, hunger, collapsed woodsheds, or men who underestimated widows until winter corrected them. But she told them enough. She told them about her mother, about the chamber, about the storm, about 16 people sitting beneath the earth when the world above had become too cold for life. And she always ended with the same image. Not the dead, not the cow, not the technical drawing on brown paper, not even the 2 eggs laid underground, though the children loved that part. She ended with the lamp, an oil lantern burning in an 8-foot deep chamber beneath a forgotten woodshed on the northern plains. Around it sat 16 people who had nowhere else to go. Above them, the wind drove snow across Dakota territory with enough force to bury roads, split trees, and turn houses into traps. But below, the flame held steady. It did not leap. It did not fail. It leaned only slightly toward the breathing shaft. Then it stood. Britta would pause there, letting the students imagine it. That small flame in the dark. That room of frightened people. That woman who had dug before anyone believed digging mattered. Then she would tell them what her mother had known long before the rest of them learned it. The earth did not shake when the storm arrived. Not if a person dug deep enough. And a woman who understood that and built accordingly needed no permission from the cold.